Welcome back to Bad Things in History, where we bring you the best of the worst every Monday. Our series examining the worst and least known events in each state continues. Nevada has had a short yet eventful history. Mining accidents, train disasters, plane crashes, and mass murder are just a few of the terrible things that have plagued the state. It has been home to so many horrible events that we had problems choosing just a few of them to share with you, but somehow we did it. Let's begin with a fire that killed several gold miners. Yellow Jacket Mine Fire. In 1849, the California gold rush began. People began flooding west, hoping to become wealthy by digging precious metals out of the ground. Many of these enterprising individuals passed through Nevada on their way to California. They noticed that it was also covered with gold and silver deposits. Starting in the 1860s, miners began spreading around the territory. Gold and silver mines became a common feature of the desert landscape. The Yellow Jacket Mine came into existence on May 1, 1859. Originally, it was constructed on a quartz deposit, but other nearby miners began finding gold. The Yellow Jacket Mine was moved several hundred feet downhill, and it too began producing gold. Starting in 1863, it became a productive location for extracting precious metals. On the morning of April 7, 1869, the good times would come to a sudden and terrible end. Someone left a lamp in the mine and forgot to retrieve it or extinguish it, so the lamp continued to burn brightly. Unfortunately, as miners dug into the rock, they also released methane deposits. Some of this methane found the unattended lamp. It created a dangerous fire more than 800 feet below the ground. The flames began spreading as the miners were changing shifts. Sadly, nobody knew of the danger until the next group of miners were lowered into the depths of the caverns below. As they moved closer and closer to the bottom, flames started surrounding them. On the surface, friends and family members of the doomed miners watched helplessly as fire began pouring out of the ground. There was simply nothing they could do. Firefighters tried to get into the mine and save those who were trapped, but smoke and flames pushed them back. In the end, they too could only stand and watch while those below died. 35 miners perished in the flames. Most of the dead were recovered, but 11 of them had to be left in the mine because recovering their bodies was too dangerous. Eventually, the shafts that caught on fire were sealed, and 3 weeks after the disaster, miners were back at work digging new tunnels. City of San Francisco derailment. Train disasters are a common feature on this channel. Usually they're the result of unfortunate accidents, but in this case it was an act of sabotage. The City of San Francisco passenger train was brought into service in 1936. It was used to carry passengers from Oakland, California to Chicago, Illinois. Part of the route included remote areas of Nevada. On August 12, 1939, the train was traveling west, headed back to Oakland. But on this day, there had been unexpected delays and the train was running late. After passing through Carlin, Nevada, the engineer decided to make up for lost time. He increased the train's speed to 90 miles per hour. At 9:33 p.m., the train was near Harney, Nevada. It began going up a hill and over an embankment as it approached a bridge, but the engineer couldn't see that the rail was damaged. Before he could apply his brakes, the train went off the tracks. The engineer survived the crash and ran to the town of Harney, where he found a phone and called for help. Volunteers rushed to the site, but they couldn't evacuate survivors until the following morning. 24 people died. 121 were injured. As authorities began investigating, they found that the tracks were damaged on purpose. Somebody purposely broke the tracks. Then they covered it with tumbleweed and brown paint to make sure it was hard to see. The Southern Pacific Railroad offered a $5,000 bounty for information about the saboteur. This resulted in the arrest of numerous homeless people. The bounty was then increased to $10,000. Despite their best efforts, investigators never located the person responsible for damaging the tracks. The case received national attention, but was then mostly forgotten for the next 30 years. On October 9, 1995, an Amtrak train derailed in Palo Verde, Arizona. Investigators found that the tracks had been sabotaged there too. There was speculation in the press that perhaps those who committed the crime were inspired by the Nevada derailment. Nobody was ever prosecuted for that disaster either. Carole Lombard plane crash. Clark Gable was born on February 1, 1901 in Cadiz, Ohio. He would go on to become one of the most popular leading men in Hollywood history. In 1924, he moved to Hollywood with his acting coach, Josephine Dillon. She was 17 years older than Clark. Despite the age difference, their relationship was productive. Josephine helped launch Clark's acting career. He divorced her in 1929, but Clark Gable wasn't lonely for long. He met a wealthy Texas socialite and married her. But that relationship was also doomed to end in failure. In 1932, Clark met Carole Lombard. They became acquainted on the set of a movie she was filming called No Man of Her Own. Although both were already married, they fell deeply in love. The pair became inseparable. In 1939, Clark Gable appeared in his most famous role as Rhett Butler in Gone with the Wind. That same year, he finally married Carole Lombard. The years he spent with her would be the happiest of his life. Unfortunately, their love affair was destined to end in tragedy. During World War II, the United States government raised funds for the war effort by selling bonds. The government enlisted celebrities to travel the country and convince Americans to buy them. In early 1942, the publicity director at MGM asked Carole if she would help. He wanted her to travel to her home state of Indiana and convince residents to purchase bonds. He also advised her to avoid flying because it was still a dangerous way to travel. Carole took the advice and spent most of her time in Indiana traveling by train. On January 16th, it was time to go back to Los Angeles, but Carole was out of patience, so she decided to board a plane in Las Vegas. Her mother joined her for the flight. Soon after takeoff, the plane veered off course. Because it was dark, the pilot couldn't see the terrain. He crashed the plane into a cliff, killing everyone on board. A search party was able to retrieve the bodies of Carole and her mother, and they were buried in Glendale, California. Clark was overwhelmed with grief and began drinking heavily. His friends tried to console him, but it had little effect. In August 1942, Clark Gable dealt with his grief by enlisting in the U.S. Army. He flew several combat missions before finally leaving the service in 1944. Clark married again 2 more times. When he died in 1960, he was buried next to Carole and her mother. Paradise Airlines crash. Famous movie stars weren't the only ones to perish in fiery plane crashes. Paradise Airlines provided service for several regional routes in the 1960s. One of the more popular flights carried passengers of San Jose, California to Lake Tahoe, California. Lake Tahoe is part of 2 different states. The eastern part of the lake is in Nevada, whereas the western half belongs to California. On March 1, 1964, a Lockheed L-049 Constellation, known as Flight 901A, took off from Oakland with 18 passengers on board. It stopped in San Jose and allowed 63 more to board the craft. At 10:39 a.m., the plane climbed into the sky and began its 50-minute flight to Lake Tahoe. Weather conditions were not favorable. Icy storms moved over the area and visibility was extremely low. The pilots still thought they could make a successful landing, so they continued descending to the airport. Witnesses later reported hearing the aircraft's engines, but due to heavy snow, most people couldn't see it. The sound of the engines stopped suddenly when the plane crashed into a mountain on the Nevada side of the lake. It took search and rescue until the next day to find the crash site. Authorities, upon arriving, discovered that looters had already visited the area. They took valuables from the bodies of the dead passengers. The crash killed 85 people. The investigation discovered that Paradise Airlines violated FAA regulations by letting pilots fly in icy conditions. Additionally, it was found that pilots within the airline filed at least 11 complaints about instruments in the planes not working correctly. Furthermore, the aircraft were not equipped with the ability to melt ice that accumulated on the wings. The Federal Aviation Administration grounded the airline. It went out of business soon thereafter. Obeying the voices. Most people who suffer from schizophrenia never kill anyone, but from time to time those who endure this condition do exactly what their hallucinations demand of them. Priscilla Joyce Ford was born in Berrien Springs, Michigan in 1929. She lived there most of her life. At a young age, it became obvious that Priscilla heard voices and saw things nobody else did. She was diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia and spent years in and out of mental institutions. In 1980, she decided it was time for a change of scenery. Priscilla moved to Reno, Nevada. She owned a 1974 Lincoln Continental, which was an exceptionally large vehicle. On Thanksgiving Day in 1980, which was on November 27th, Priscilla decided to go for a drive. As she was driving, voices began telling her to kill. Priscilla decided to obey. She drove down the street at 40 miles an hour, then moved onto the sidewalk. Then she plowed right into a crowd of people. 7 victims were killed, 23 more were injured. Priscilla stopped her car and was then arrested by the police. She asked one of the police officers how many people she had killed. He told her, 5 or 6. By one account, Priscilla responded, "Good. The more dead, the better." At first, she was found incompetent to stand trial, but that decision was reversed in August 1981. The trial began later in the year and lasted almost 5 months. Priscilla was charged with 6 counts of murder and 23 counts of attempted murder. During the trial, Priscilla testified that she was the reincarnation of Jesus Christ. Her daughter testified that it was all true. She talked about Jesus Christ, about her being Jesus Christ, about me being Jesus Christ. She talked about my aunt, about me being artificially inseminated to bear Jesus Christ. On March 28, 1982, a jury found Priscilla guilty on all counts. She was sentenced to die in the gas chamber. Priscilla was never executed. Appeals kept her sentence from being carried out. She was also a chain smoker. Priscilla Ford died of emphysema on January 29, 2005. These are just a few of the terrible things in Nevada's history. We didn't have time to discuss nuclear weapons or the deadly industrial accidents. Perhaps one day we will make a second part to this episode. What do you think about Nevada? Were we very selective in what we chose to cover? Or is it truly a dangerous and horrible place? Let us know what you think in the comments. Do you enjoy the fact that we keep making new content every week? If so, please help grow our channel. Like this video and subscribe if you haven't already. Every little bit helps. Thank you for watching Bad Things in History.